sorry, a few adjustments. Morning. I just want to thank Miles and the team for inviting me again. Just a quick show of hands. Who was here in 2019? Just a quick. Okay, thank you. I'm not trying to wake you up. It's just that my presentation is building on the one that I had in 2019. So where are we? The first issue is we're going to be taking stock, and we're basically looking at the effective introduction of the legislation. As we all know, this legislation was introduced on the 1st of January 2019, and that means that it's applicable for accounting periods ended the 31st of December 2019, which we have done returns on, hopefully on the 1st of January 2021, if we were not late. So we know that we're well into the substance regime. So by now, a lot of you would have either seen or done tax returns that include economic substance information. And also, we know that some of you, or the less fortunate ones or the unfortunate ones, have probably accrued a few penalties due to either missed returns or not meeting any substance requirements. So just the gist of the legislation is basically the introduction of the legislation was to align the Isle of Man tax regulations with the EU and the OECD. So what the EU have done is they've basically taken what the OECD work on base erosion and profit shifting, which is BEPS, an introduction of a concept that was meant to stop the artificial shifting of profits from high tax jurisdictions to low or nominal tax jurisdictions. That sounds a bit technical, but what it essentially is to stop the likes of the GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, and Amazon from shifting profits as they wish. So, just on the penalty position, which is my second bullet point, we just need to acknowledge the fact that we may have accrued penalties, but that's actually not the end of the world. We could possibly find a way of addressing what we haven't addressed previously in the past. Then my next point is on the impact of COVID and Brexit-19. So what about COVID-19 and Brexit? Brexit didn't make the problem go away. It actually made it, if anything, give it a bit more bite, because the EU will be coming to perform peer reviews on the Isle of Man tax division, and I'm sure they will really be keeping a close eye to make sure that we comply, because we signed up to an EU code of conduct on taxation matters. That means that we will do essentially as we are told with regards to our tax behavior, which really makes us more aspirational as to aligning ourselves with probably other tax jurisdictions that are probably not low or nominal tax jurisdictions. What about COVID? COVID happened. We all know COVID happened. Other jurisdictions like the UK and Jersey did have guidance with regards to how to treat the impact of COVID, especially on global travel restrictions. But unfortunately, the Isle of Man Tax Authority did not provide any guidance. They will look at each taxpayer's circumstances on a case-by-case basis. What that means is essentially they will look at you and say, well, you can't turn around and say, well, I was going to have my meeting in the Isle of Man, I was going to put substance on the Isle of Man, but COVID happened. They now need to actually know that, were you having meetings pre-COVID, and what did you do about it within the COVID period to try and mitigate the impact of COVID? So you can't argue that, well, I haven't done anything because of COVID. Well, we should have at least done something, and provided documentary proof to prove that you actually did make an effort to meet substance during the COVID interruptions. Updates in the legislation and guidelines, that's essentially has been the introduction with effect from the 1st of July 2021, the extension of the substance scope to partnerships, and that's essentially something that is probably more relevant to Jersey and Guernsey, because there is a fund scope out in there as well. But within the Isle of Man, yes, we do have partnerships, but we do not expect, at least for the IP sector, the eGaming sector, we don't imagine it will have any significant impact. So what about the e-gaming sector? We fall primarily or predominantly within the IP entity, relevant sector definition. That means we are companies that either hold IP or earn income from the exploitation of IP. Essentially, that's what it is. It is quite a wide definition. A lot of people have tried to get out of the scope by saying, well, I'm just a distributor, I don't own IP. But you can not distribute without actually getting a license, and that license is an asset, it is IP. A good test is you can look at yourself and say, well, I don't have a lot of machinery, I don't have a lot of tangible assets. Where is my 20 million pounds coming from? Well, it's coming from IP. It's something that is intangible. So you need to look closely at your agreements with either your distributors and your if you're an aggregator, you will be buying a lot of slot machines from other developers and then selling them on to players within other jurisdictions. So you do exploit IP. Alternatively, if you do hold IP, which is a case that we typically see, and that typically happens within a group situation, because half the times or sometimes or a few other times we'll find that the IP is actually developed elsewhere and it is exploited within an entity within the Isle of Man. That actually makes you a high risk IP. So you actually rise up the food chain. So that means you've actually got more trouble, you've got a higher threshold that you need to meet to prove substance. So I have gone through typical scenarios. Feedback on industry practice, again, a lot of people have done nothing. Some people have done something, and some people have done things right. So you need to self-assess as an entity. Where are you? Have you done nothing? Have you done something? Or have you done everything right that has been asked of you? Practical challenges that we see every day. One, interpretation of the legislation. A lot of people are looking for, I've got a brilliant idea. Actually, I don't meet within substance. I don't meet the legislation. So don't try and assume that you actually meet the legislation, then prove yourself as not meeting the legislation, other than just assuming that you don't meet the legislation. Because what often happens is you then fail to take appropriate action in time. A stitch in time saves 9. So as long as you don't actually go further down on the penalty chain, because ultimately, remember, this legislation, if you don't comply for 2 consecutive years, in the 3rd year, the assessor of income taxes has the right, she actually has an option to apply that your entity be struck off the register, so you'll have a lot of assets, a lot of income that has no home. The second issue that we see is use of financial information. Again, we are not identifying where the incomes come from. Is it come from tangible assets or does it come from intangible assets? And I'm not going to let the accountants go away with this one. Sometimes an entity does seemingly have intellectual property, but because IP assets tend to be hard to value, a lot of people just say, well, we just forget about it. We just know there's 20 million income. They've just got desks and chairs, but they've got no other assets. And they've got no employees. They will have probably 1 or 2 employees. How can 1 or 2 employees be generating 200 million worth of revenue? So it's always applying a common sense approach to look at what your financial statements look like, and making sure that you actually capture things correctly, because the statutory definition does include you into scope. Even though you have not shown anything in the financial statements, you still will be in scope. Board meetings, what and where? You'll find board meetings. I think the last time the people that were here, we agreed that we are not going to sit around a table and just have tea and just ratify decisions that have been made elsewhere. I don't want to use this word, i.e. puppet directors, but it does exist. Somebody coined it, not me. So we just don't want people to just ratify decisions that have been made elsewhere. We actually want directors on the island that form a quorum for the majority of the board meetings to be meeting on island and making decisions that are key to running of the business. That is how we prove substance. It's not just having, I've seen a standard standard minute templates that just really doesn't talk about a lot, that just get branded about. A lot of the times it comes through the CSPs. We need to change the way we do things. Sometimes you don't even have a location of the minutes, you just have a letterhead, and that's it. So we just need to be aware and take cognizance of the fact that our minutes need to reflect key decisions that are made on the island by the majority of the board with a quorum. Next challenge is availability of suitably qualified staff. We are raving on about the creation of jobs, but one of the challenges that the Chamber of Commerce, who recently did a survey, found out from their members is that a good number of the people were saying that one of the key challenges was they were not being able to recruit suitably qualified staff on the island for the jobs that they want. And again, IP is a key sector. You can't just have someone managing such a technical asset without adequate knowledge. So it will be a challenge to just have a standard CSP person managing IP that has so much cyber risk, that has so much IP protection protocols, that has so much in the way of agreements that need to be signed for that IP to be exploited. And half the times, in fact, most of the times, it's being exploited in another jurisdiction. So we just really need to be careful that the people that we are managing the business actually have the right skills. I think that's the reason maybe we now have some CSPs that actually have specialized skills. I think Man Banham has an eGaming advisory sector so that we can actually keep an advisory team so that they can actually deliver customized solutions to clients. What if we don't meet substance? What are our possible mitigation steps? Again, this has to happen with consultation. You can't just attach a solution to a problem that's not appropriate or a problem that does not exist. So don't just take this and say, well, I can go and do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You first need to identify what the issue is for you to appropriately address any gaps that you have. And of course, I mean, the most popular one is enhanced substance on the island. Sometimes you find stuff in other jurisdictions that are traditional developers of IP assets are not willing to move to the island. That is a challenge. What do you do about that? There is an option to outsource your core income generating activities, but if you do outsource, it has to be on the island. If it ends up being that outsource being outside the island for core income generating activities, that is not permissible. You can outsource non-core activities such as your backroom accounting and HR from the island, but the key activities that generate the IP income, i.e., if it's development of IP, if it's exploitation, the person who manages the customer accounts, the person who does the IT security, the person who switches on the server, those people need to be based on the island for us to be able to prove adequate substance on the island. And next, another option, alternative option, is a Section 2 application. This is essentially where if your entity is also managed and controlled in another jurisdiction, you could prove, provided you are registered in that jurisdiction, and you can provide a tax residence certificate from that foreign jurisdiction. There is an option for you to opt out of the Isle of Man tax regime and only be tax resident in that other Isle of Man tax regime. You'll still be allowed to have your registration, yeah. You'll still be allowed to have your operations, yeah. It's only that for tax purposes, you'll be seen to be resident in another jurisdiction and not the Isle of Man, with the approval of the assessor, who will have requirements. And then group restructuring options. Sometimes people decide to redom to a jurisdiction where they have adequate substance. Sometimes people decide to move their assets, their business. Again, redom and moving the assets is difficult sometimes because of the IP protocol controls. You need to make sure that you actually have license and you'll be able to register your software and your copyrights in that other jurisdiction before you actually move them. So that can prove to be problematic, but I have seen it happen. So I think it's just an issue of having adequate consultation. I think, ladies and gentlemen, that is it from me. That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you.